So, some of them. Committee will come to order. Committee meets today to hear testimony on the President's proposed authorization for the use of military force against ISIS. This hearing is just the first committee event on this issue, but given the expertise of the witnesses today, I think it will raise many of the issues and considerations that we will need to follow up on in the future. Previously, we've heard testimony that the threat posed by Islamic jihadists is growing. Last September, President Obama said, and I want to quote here, "Our objective is clear. We will degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL through a comprehensive and sustained counterterrorism strategy," end quote. Many people, including me, are concerned, however, that we do not really have a clear strategy that will accomplish that goal. An AUMF is not a strategy. It is only an authorization to use military force against a particular enemy. In spite of the fact that the President ordered military action against ISIS to begin several months ago, and only now has submitted a request to Congress to authorize such action, I believe it's still important for the United States Congress to do its constitutional duty. But I have a number of questions and concerns about the President's language. First, as we've experienced with the 2001 AUMF, defining the enemy is difficult, especially as they adapt and form new allegiances and seek to manipulate our system. Second, we already put too many encumbrances on our troops in carrying out the missions they are assigned, in my opinion. So going into battle with a lawyer nearby to decide whether a particular action is enduring or offensive or a ground combat operation seems problematic. Third, I know that some are concerned about the time limitation included in this draft. I think a forcing action that requires Congress to consider and possibly update an AUMF may be useful. But I want to hear from our witnesses their views because I recognize the drawbacks of unintentionally telegraphing a timeline to the enemy. A vote to authorize a president to send American men and women into battle is as serious and sobering a vote as any vote cast by a member of Congress. Our country has always been incredibly fortunate to have had individuals of outstanding bravery and dedication defending our nation and the American way of life. We are facing a cruel and savage opponent. Our service members must know that their mission carries the full weight of approval under our constitutional system and that the administration, this Congress, and the American people will stand with them and support them as long as it takes to accomplish the missions which they have been assigned. That will be my goal as we go through this process. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think there's really two topics for this morning's hearing. One is the basic details of the AUMF with regards to Syria and Iraq and ISIL. And it's a very, very difficult thing to do because Congress wants to strike the balance. We do not want to give the President a blank check and take away any of our authority. On the other hand, we don't want to restrict the executive branch in a way that hampers his ability to carry out the mission. That from a language standpoint can be virtually impossible, and I think the chairman mentioned some of the areas of tension there. The timeline, I think the timeline is fine because, as the chairman mentions, Congress can come back and reauthorize. It sort of makes sure that we stay as part of the process, that we don't let our constitutional authority slip. The tougher questions are, how do we define military engagement without simply giving the President the right to do whatever, whenever? And I'll get more into this in the strategy session, but I, for one, think that it would be a mistake strategically to excessively rely on U.S. military force to try and solve this problem. So I am looking for ways to limit that, to make sure that we don't have an executive that thinks that the military is the solution to this problem, because we should all keep in mind, whatever President Obama's personal position on this is, this AUMF would carry over to another president, which we can't be sure of. So I think those limitations are important but difficult to articulate, which brings me to the real issue here today, which I think is the broader strategy. What is the broader strategy? I think it can be fairly simply defined in the sense that we need to get to the point where the Muslim world rejects this type of violent extremism. And I think one of the things that makes the strategy so difficult is it is a moving target. Back in 9/11, it was all about al-Qaeda and al-Qaeda senior leadership in Afghanistan. But the ideology is so much broader than that, as everybody here knows. It crops up in all manner of different places, from al-Shabaab to Boko Haram to Ansar al-Sharia. It is an ideology that is becoming far too deeply rooted in that part of the world. How do we stop it? Well, the short answer is we don't stop it. Because the most dependable part of the message that al-Qaeda has is to basically say that they are defending the Muslim world against Western aggression. The last thing in the world we want is either, a whole bunch of U.S. troops to show up and try to fix the problem, or just as bad, a whole bunch of U.S. policymakers going over there and telling Muslim countries and Muslim governments how they should conduct themselves. They're not going to be responsive to that. This is a problem that has to be solved internally by these countries. And the real strategic challenge for us here is, how can we help without making the problem worse? It's a very delicate balance, and I'd be very interested in hearing from the three of you on how we can engage in that, because this is an ideological struggle. This isn't about defeating AQAP or defeating al-Qaeda senior leadership, or even primarily about defeating ISIL. It's about stopping this just horrific ideology that has spread to too many parts of the Muslim world. How do we stop it? How do we get that to be turned around? Because the truth is, the overwhelming majority of the Muslim world rejects this ideology and rejects this strategy, and yet it marches on. How do we work with that to change that? And then the final key piece of this that makes it very difficult to develop a strategy is we keep tripping over another aspect of conflict in that world, and that is the Shia-Sunni divide. We may well be in there fighting ISIL, but if ISIL is fighting Shia, as they were in Iraq, and the main reason they were so successful in Iraq is because the Sunni Iraqis looked at Baghdad and said, that's not my government. That is a government that is sectarian, that is protecting Shia, that is doing nothing for us. So they basically sided with ISIL, not so much because they loved ISIL's ideology, but because they found it preferable to Shia rule. If somehow, some way, Saudi Arabia and Iran could find a way to peacefully coexist tomorrow, a huge chunk of this problem would go away. Now, that's obviously easier said than done, but it is part of the equation, is figuring out the Shia-Sunni split. So I think part of the reason people are confounded sometimes on the strategy level is because this is a moving target with lots of complicated pieces. It defies a two-sentence strategy. And in fact, I don't think we would be well served by coming up with that two-sentence strategy. It's a dynamic problem. We have to be flexible in terms of how we respond to it. But one piece of it is, with the U.S. engaged militarily against ISIL, as I think it should be, Congress should play its role. We should authorize that use of military force within whatever parameters we as a body decide. With that, I yield back, and I look forward to the testimony and the questions.
Thank the gentleman. I ask unanimous consent that a letter that Mr. Smith and I received from retired General James Mattis, former CENTCOM commander, on the AUMF be made part of the record. Without objection, so ordered. And without objection, each of your written statements will be made part of our record as well. Let me welcome our witnesses. We're very fortunate today to have retired General Jack Keane, former Vice Chief of Staff for the U.S. Army, Robert M. Chesney, Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, and Charles I. Francis, Professor of Law at the University of Texas School of Law, an outstanding institution, I would add. Benjamin Wittes, Senior Fellow of Government Studies at the Brookings Institution, and as many of y'all know, Mr. Chesney and Mr. Wittes are both associated also with the Lawfare blog, which is widely read on these constitutional national security issues. So thank you all for being here. General Keane, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Minority Smith, members of the committee, Thank you for inviting me to testify today on the President's request for authorization of use of military force. I'm honored to be here again and to share the panel with my distinguished colleagues. I've been testifying here for 15 years before this committee, and I just want to tell you once again how much I appreciate the support that you provide to our armed forces through all these years and what you're doing currently. I've always appreciated your serious and thoughtful approach to the nation's business, regardless of who's been the majority in this committee. Please reference the map that I provided at the end of my testimony when I discussed the enemy and its geography. It was prepared by the Institute for the Study of War, where I'm the chairman. This was a part of a recent intelligence summary and is useful to understand how ISIS looks at the world. My remarks will be brief, highlighting essential observations only, permitting the focus to be your questions. In principle, I agree with the President, who desires to use military force beyond a short-term contingency, requests an AUMF from the Congress. The current AUMFs 2001 and 2, which are obviously still in use, are in their design good documents, and that it is clear why military force is being authorized and provides latitude for the President to determine how to use that force. Indeed, an argument can be made that the President's current AUMF request is unnecessary, in that the previous AUMFs provide sufficient authorization for the use of force against ISIS. Nonetheless, I do believe it is better public policy for a new AUMF based on the reality that ISIS is a different threat in terms of its scale, mode of operation, location, and near-term intent. As to the President's current AUMF request, I would like to make a few observations. The strategy. Strategy is how the military force is used. This is the President's lane, along with his senior military commanders. As much as I and some members of Congress are critical of the administration for not having a comprehensive strategy to defeat radical Islam, nor an adequate strategy to defeat ISIS, the AUMF is not the appropriate document for that expression. A President needs maximum flexibility to adapt to the enemy and the battlefield environment, which at times may demand a change in strategy. The enemy. The enemy is ISIS, and the proposed AUMF describes it as ISIS and associates. ISIS has claimed contractual agreements and a written plan approved by ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi to form satellites in Libya, Egyptian Sinai, Afghanistan, and also Algeria, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. Some of these affiliations are likely aspirational, to be sure, but ISIS is exporting military capability to make affiliates in Sinai and Libya stronger. All that said, defeating ISIS does not mean that U.S. forces are needed to defeat ISIS satellites. The geography. Core ISIS is principally located in Iraq and Syria, but it covets territory in a broader region including Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Israel, and lands that are part of historic caliphates like the Caucasus. As such, there should be no geographical limitation in the AUMF. The time constraint. It makes no sense to me to tell our allies and the enemy that we are uncertain of this commitment of force by our unwillingness to extend it beyond 3 years. Congress has the authority to provide continuous assessments through its oversight committees, which is far more appropriate than a 3-year sunset. The ground force constraint. ISIS cannot be defeated in Iraq and Syria without a decisive ground force victory. There is no ground force in Syria, and no one knows if the Iraq ground force can defeat ISIS. Why put limits on the use of a ground force when it's widely recognized as the only means to defeat ISIS? Indeed, it may be necessary for a coalition ground force, with the United States likely in the lead, to ultimately defeat ISIS. The ground force constraint should be removed from the AUMF if the true goal is to defeat ISIS. In conclusion, the proposed AUMF is not an acceptable document. The time and ground force constraint must be removed. This President, as well as the next President, deserve latitude in the use of military force. Additionally, how to use the military force or strategy is not an appropriate topic for this document, as I previously stated, but it is essential for the Congress to provide oversight and, in so doing, understand the feasibility of the strategy actually working. I believe it is a matter of conscience to only support an AUMF if there is confidence that the strategy our troops execute will indeed succeed in defeating ISIS. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Professor Chesney?
Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. And I associate myself with General Keene's remarks about the tremendous history of this committee and the way it conducts its business. I'd like to make 6 points this morning. First, the draft AUMF lacks a stated purpose in its operative sections. This is in contrast, for example, to the 2001 AUMF, and it's potentially significant. To be sure, the question of purpose is for policymakers to decide ultimately, not lawyers, but the lawyers in drafting an AUMF need to know what the purpose is in order to make sure their work product is suited to accomplishing the mission. And the public needs to know the purpose as well. And so as you improve upon the draft, I hope you will insist upon a clear statement of purpose in it. Second, the draft's attempt to forbid, quote, enduring offensive ground combat operations is a grossly indeterminate phrase on its face, and it should be dropped. Notwithstanding examples given by the White House in its transmittal letter accompanying the draft, the language inevitably will cast a shadow of uncertainty over commanders' operational decisions. The statement by Secretary Kerry this past Tuesday explaining a bit about what it means in his understanding, referring to overnight embedding being okay, but weeks upon weeks of some form of ground presence not being okay, I think underscores rather than assuages this concern. Simply put, commanders should not be left to guess where the boundaries lie. Third, at no point in American history has Congress ever simultaneously authorized the use of force to destroy an enemy militarily, while at the same time purporting to forbid the commander-in-chief from using ground forces towards that end. In fairness, there have been several authorizations in our history that have been narrow in various ways, but in all such cases, the objective was much narrower than the military destruction of the enemy. Instead, these were cases in which the objective involved important but limited things such as ending piracy against our shipping or participation in a peacekeeping operation. Of course, if the actual objective with respect to ISIL is not its military destruction, but instead something relatively more narrow yet still important, then the analogy to past narrow authorizations may work much better. But this simply underscores my earlier point about the need for clarity regarding the purpose of the AUMF and our mission. All that said, I can't say that Congress would lack the authority to enact such a limitation if it truly wishes to do so. I'm simply pointing out that it would be unprecedented in a particular way, and it's certainly closer to the constitutional borderline than things we've seen in the past. Fourth, I want to share my thoughts on what we usually call sunsets, although I'm beginning to think that we should get away from the sunset language because of the connotation it has for many people, that it suggests that it's predetermined that there won't actually be renewal. Perhaps it's better to talk about them as renewal or forcing function provisions. The idea, of course, is to create an occasion after a certain period of time when the authorization, if appropriate, will receive the fresh imprimatur of a Congress and a president acting on the most recent conditions. And in this respect, I would just point out where we are with the 2001 AUMF, which of course is still a critical instrument. It supports our anti-Al-Qaeda operations around the world, from Yemen to Somalia, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iraq as well. It's been 13 years plus since it was enacted, and the passage of time has led many to criticize it on the grounds that it's somehow become stale, that it's become attenuated as Al-Qaeda has evolved. And it is a shame, I think, that we haven't had a past occasion where it's been clearly refreshed by a more recent Congress in order to avoid these kinds of problems, which create friction in the reliance upon the AUMF. Now, it's true that it did partially get refreshed in the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2012, but that refreshment, unfortunately, was limited to reference to the detention authority, and rather than being a full refreshment. But the point is, the experience with the 2001 AUMF illustrates how there is something to be said in favor of being able to continue to operate under an AUMF if you ensure that Congress will in fact come back to it after a certain number of years. I recognize, however, that you cannot create a sunset or renewal provision that signals to the enemy that we're starting off with one foot already out the door. And so in thinking about how you strike the balance here, my conclusion is that the better way to go is not a 3-year but a 5-year sunset, which also has the virtue of not landing this particular renewal provision on the doorstep of a newly elected president who may still be getting fully acclimated into the office and getting personnel into place. My next point is about the silence of the draft AUMF on matters of detention, which is rather striking, if you ask me. Another lesson of the past 13 years is that the silence of an AUMF on detention is itself a cause for great legal friction if and when the United States may decide that in addition to using lethal force against ISIL targets, heaven forbid, we actually detain some in military custody for the duration of our conflict. If and when we come to that point, we will regret, I think, not having said something in the AUMF clarifying detention authority. So at a minimum, I hope Congress will consider that issue. Last, there's the question of whether all this is moot, because the administration, though asking for this ISIL-specific AUMF, it does continue to assert that it has the authority to do what it is doing already under color of the 2001 AUMF and possibly as well under Article 2 of the Constitution. I don't think it's entirely moot. As an initial matter, the 2001 AUMF argument and the constitutional argument that have been the backdrop up to this point, up to this very moment, are not without their detractors. They're far from obviously correct arguments, and that in itself creates a lot of legal friction. Insofar as we're putting our armed forces into harm's way, they deserve a clear legal endorsement for what they're doing from this body. As to the particular constraints in the draft AUMF being moot, again, at one level, yes, as a lawyer, I can explain to someone if they have the time and patience to listen to me as to why the constraints in the new AUMF, since they aren't present in the old one, don't really matter. But I think that's, while true as a legal matter, it's different as a political and rhetorical matter. And the existence of these constraints in the new AUMF will cast a shadow back over the old one and create more legal friction. So for that reason alone, I think this proposal really does have to be taken quite seriously. So let me stop there. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Wittes.
Thank you, Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee for inviting me to present my views on the President's proposed authorization for the use of military force against the Islamic State. I want to advance, I'm more modest than Bobby on this, I want to advance only two basic arguments today. And the first is that the administration's draft ISIL AUMF, while it is a significantly flawed document, is flawed in ways that are somewhat different from many of the criticisms being advanced against it. So I want to start by separating what, from my vantage point anyway, is the wheat from the chaff, and sort of dispensing with a number of the criticisms of the draft that are, to my judgment at least, meritless or having significantly less merit than than their presence in the conversation. So many critics have worried that the draft AUMF would limit the president and his successor in prosecuting the war, and some in this regard, some have worried about the limitation on the use of ground forces. Others have argued that the problem is chiefly the 3-year proposed sunset. I think both concerns are actually misplaced, at least as a legal matter, though Professor Chesney's point that they may have political, operate as political constraints is certainly a valid one. And I think it's misplaced as a legal matter for largely the same reason, which Professor Chesney just alluded to, which is that this authorization, at least as the administration proposes it, is not the president's only source of authority to use force. And so limitations in the authorization do limit presidential power to the extent that some other authority exists for the contemplated action. The proposed authorization leaves in place untouched the 2001 AUMF, which the administration has construed quite broadly, which does, including to cover all of its operations today, and which doesn't contain a sunset provision. So the result is that you actually have these optical restraints that don't in fact do what they seem to say they're doing. So moreover, I think it's implausible, and both of my co-panelists have mentioned this, that the ground force limitation in the AUMF is quite what it seems to be, even if it were the only source of authority. And the reason is the elasticity of the word enduring and offensive. And I think the resolution does not define either word. And there's just a lot of room for elastic interpretation there. And I can't imagine that administration that wanted to use ground forces in any significant way would not be able to either define them as not offensive or define them as something less than enduring. A number of commentators have also complained that the draft resolution contains no hard geographic limitations that would contain it to Iraq and Syria. I think this criticism actually denigrates what is one of the virtues of the administration's AUMF. ISIL is a fluid enemy. It is by no means likely to restrict its activities to Iraq and Syria. And as General Keane points out, it's already developing relationships with countries elsewhere, with groups elsewhere that, would be off limits if a hard geographical limitation were in the document and the document were legally operative. I ask you to consider that if a similar geographic limitation had been inside the original 2001 AUMF, we would never have been able to undertake, under that authorization, operations against AQAP, which have been so vital to American counterterrorism. So all that said, I do think the administration's draft has serious problems, which mostly have their roots in the proposal's breadth and failure to grapple with the relationship with the underlying 2001 AUMF. Now, as a lot of people have noted, the document on its face does not appear broad. It seems to have all these limitations, but it's actually written very carefully to create the impression of significant limitations without the reality. And the administration's lawyers have succeeded in this to a degree that they are being denounced for the breadth, for the restrictions in the proposal, rather than developing anxiety about its actual breadth. In fact, the real problem is that despite the appearance of accepting restraint, the document contains virtually no meaningful restraints at all. And the reason for that is the failure to grapple with the underlying 2001 AUMF, which it leaves in place without any, I also have developed anxieties about the word sunset, but without any forcing mechanism for reconsideration. So under the administration's proposal, at least as a legal matter, the president would have all the authority he has today, including all the authority to fight ISIL, under the 2001 AUMF, and in addition to that, he would also be granted 3 years of even broader authority to target ISIL and its associated forces. And by the way, the draft defines associated forces quite broadly. Thus, the limitations on ground forces is entirely meaningless since the 2001 AUMF remains in place. This doesn't concern me particularly because I don't actually favor a ground force limitation, but for those who do favor a ground force limitation, I think you should be particularly concerned by one that's there in appearance but not in reality. The 3-year sunset is also largely meaningless because the 2001 AUMF doesn't sunset. And the reporting requirements, which are quite anemic on their own terms, are similarly empty, and I think that should be of particular concern to this committee. Second point I want to advance is that there's an alternative to this approach. In November of last year, my co-panelists, Robert Chesney, Jack Goldsmith, Matt Waxman, and I jointly drafted a possible AUMF, which we sort of imagined as a way of sort of kickstarting a discussion on the subject. It did, and actually a lot of consensus developed between our author group and a group over at the Just Security website about the components of a new AUMF. Unlike the President's recent proposal, our proposal aimed to integrate authorization for the fight against ISIL into authorization for the larger conflict. And we tried to supplant the existing AUMF with a more modern document to respond to exactly the concerns that Professor Chesney just laid out. So I want to identify a few aspects of this proposal that are that are relevant in light of the criticisms that the President's AUMF has received, both from the right, left, and center. So first, unlike the President's draft, our proposal would subsume the current AUMF, which covers, as the administration and the courts interpreted, al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and associated forces, and it would then repeal the underlying document. The result is that there would be a single authorization for fighting al-Qaeda, the Taliban, ISIL, and all of their associates. Second, because there would be no duplication in the authorization, the proposal's sunset provision would actually mean something. It would actually serve the forcing function that the chairman was referring to. Third, while the draft does not contain specific geographic limitations, as the President's does, like the President's, it does not contain that, but it does authorize force only where it could be used consistent with applicable international law concerning sovereignty and the use of force, thus giving some territorial guidance. It would allow the sort of things we did with al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. It would not allow, say, the use of force or authorize the use of force, in France. And fourth, the proposal contains significantly more robust reporting requirements than does the administration's draft. And I would urge you, even if you're proceeding off of the administration's draft, to look at the disparity between what we would have asked them to report and what they want to have reported. I think that difference alone is very substantial. So look, I have no doubt that our proposal could stand significant improvement in any number of areas. And there are aspects of it, actually looking back at it 5 months after we wrote it, that I would change. But I think our draft offers an approach that is far less susceptible than the administration's draft to the concerns that many scholars across the political spectrum have raised. And as this body considers how to authorize the conflict against ISIL, and really importantly, how that authorization should interact with the existing AUMF, our proposal may offer an alternative way forward that might attract a broader swath of support. So thank you very much. Look forward to taking any questions.
Thank you, and I appreciate, again, testimony from each of you. I guess I would like to have each of you comment on kind of a basic question, which is, how important do you think it is for Congress to authorize a use of military force? I'm not really talking about whether the 2001 covers ISIL. Although that's an interesting question I hope we get to today. What I'm talking about is some people argue that Article 2 means the President can do whatever he needs to do to protect the country, and terrorism is a threat, so he can take action whenever and however he wants to. On a more practical level, some folks say he's been bombing for 6 months. Why do you need to act now? It's just don't worry about it. Let it go on. So, Mr. Wittes, starting with you, I would like to hear your views about the constitutional and legal importance of Congress acting to authorize a president's use of military force. And then, General Keane, by the time we get back to you, I would like to hear how that affects our troops, how they see Congress acting or not acting to authorize the missions on which the Commander-in-Chief sends them. So if we can just go backwards up the line. Mr. Wittes?
Sure. I mean, look, at a practical level, at a basic brass tacks practical level, the military is going to do what the Commander-in-Chief orders it to do, assuming it's lawful order, irrespective of whether this body passes a document or not. And so at that level, it is probably true that in some very tangible, immediate way, it doesn't matter all that much. I would say, however, that it matters very much for 3 reasons. One is, I just have a moral problem with the idea of asking U.S. troops to engage in a long-term set of military operations without them knowing that the political branches of their government are behind them. And I think it's just not an appropriate thing it's not an appropriate message to send to our own people. Number 2, at the level of, I don't know if it's constitutional law, but it's certainly constitutional hygiene. Relying on a more than 13-year-old document that's about a different organization in a different part of the world to conduct military operations now for a different reason, I think that's a very bad way for Congress and the administration to behave. It's not good to have legal authorities that you have to stretch and torture to have them reach the problems that you face. We should go through the exercise as a democratic polity of describing the war that we actually want to fight and doing so. And then the third reason, which I think is a defense of this body's prerogatives with war powers. If you all believe that in fact, the definition of the parameters of a war is not something that this body has, that's not something you have a stake in, it's not, part of why you got elected to office, then fair enough, maybe you shouldn't be involved in the conversation. But if that sounds like a sort of insulting thing to say, and of course this body has a role in defining the parameters of scope of military action overseas, and of course it has an oversight function, then this is a critical aspect of this body's engagement with its own constitutional responsibilities in this area.
Mr. Chairman, passage of an AUMF specific to ISIL will signal resolve and commitment of this country both to our allies, which is a critical matter, and to the enemy itself, which is an even more critical matter. It will also signal to our troops and our commanders this institution's investment of its own political capital, all of you and all your colleagues, all of your political capital being put on the table in support of what they're being asked to do. And I think all that matters as a practical matter very much in terms of that critical function, the legitimacy of the effort and the perception that it's going to be sustained over time to accomplish the mission. Turning to the particular angle the chairman mentioned, how does this interact, or what does it say if we don't do it and Article 2 authorities are being relied upon in the background, separate from the 2001 AUMF? Article 2 national self-defense authorities of the president to use military force in defense of the country are broad and important, but they're far less capable of marshaling the credibility of this government and crystallizing public support than the ability that this body has, that Congress has, to pass an AUMF. And it's also clear, as been alluded to, with the passage of time, strict reliance on Article 2 alone, if there's no authorization that plausibly supports what's happening, begins to become more and more problematic with time's passage and generates legal friction, as I mentioned in my opening remarks. I think that at this stage, now that the issue's been put to Congress, a failure to act, a failure to authorize would put us in an even worse spot than we were in terms of the degree of signals of unity by this government supporting this mission than where we were a month ago when we were carrying on these operations strictly on the President's combination of Article 2 authorities in the 2001 AUMF. At this stage, I do think Congress needs to step up with some appropriate endorsement if indeed it believes in the mission.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. It's indisputable the President has the authorities to do what he needs to do in terms of military force. And look, at our troops, they're always going to respond to the orders of their officers, take on the most difficult tasks. Something has really happened in the use of military force and our troops' reaction to it, in my judgment, because I transcended from the pre-9/11 military to the post-9/11 military. I've been very close to both of it. And, pre-9/11, we were, to include much of World War II, this was always about helping somebody else. And incredible expenditure of national treasure by the American people to make the world a better place and achieve security and stability for others, even though maybe we may not have been directly involved. Post-9/11, and morale was always high. When the troops are off doing something, they have a sense of purpose about it, they have a sense of accomplishment, they have an incredible, intense shared camaraderie with each other in being associated with people that are drawn, that not only have the motivation to do what we're asking them to do, but actually have the wherewithal to do it. And that's very different. Post 9/11, quite different, because this has been and is today all about the American people. And our troops get it. We have a 9/11 generation in the United States military as a result of it. The Central Intelligence Agency has a 9/11 generation in it as a result of this. They have a dogged determination to succeed and make this right for the American people. So that aspect of our troops and their commitment to do what is asked of them is quite extraordinary. And I know you know that. I'm just reinforcing what I think you know and trying to find my own words to explain it. But this is a pluralistic democratic society, more democratic than any other society on earth. This government is not just about the executive branch. You are the representatives of the people. of this great country. It would never be lost on our troops that you are part of the authorization for the use of military force when we're conducting a campaign that will be protracted. And that's what this is. So I absolutely believe this is the right thing to do, to come together, to show the determination and resolve, and to back the orders of the President of the United States, and certainly back the execution of those orders by our troops.
Thank you. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to focus on the broader strategy question, because I think that's really, I mean, that bleeds into the controversy over the AUMF, is the disagreement over strategy. You know, how limited it should be, how open should it be. This is a moving enemy, as has been noted by many. The 2001 AUMF morphed in a variety of different directions, primarily because the enemy morphed. And the enemy here is the broader ideology. And I'm wondering if any of you could shed some light on the sort of damned if we do, damned if we don't situation of this is a military issue. You know, I've heard people say, you know, there's going to be no military solution to this problem. And I know what they mean. I also know that they're wrong. What they mean is that the broader, you're not going to win the ideology. You're not going to kill your way to victory. I mean, many generals have said, the General McChrystal most notably. But there is a clear military element to it. We have got to stop the various groups from gaining ground, from launching terrorist attacks, from killing people. And the military is going to be part of it. But at the same time, the more we engage, the more that helps recruitment. What can we do to begin to help turn around this ideological problem? And I know that the answer to that is to have strong, moderate Muslim voices that reject this ideology and offer a reasonable alternative. But I'm not exactly holding my breath waiting for that to happen because they've struggled. So what can we do in the U.S. To help the broader ideological struggle? Because otherwise we're just going to be, you know, it started in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Yemen. It's Libya, it's Somalia, it's Nigeria, it's, you know, Mali. I mean, it's going to be everywhere, and it's going to pop up. And I'm, you know, people have been criticized the whole whack-a-mole strategy. Sometimes there are moles that need to be whacked, and I've got no problem with that, particularly if they're getting ready to whack you first. But that doesn't get to that broader ideological struggle of how we get the Muslim world to comprehensively reject this ideology, or more to the point, what we can do to help with that. Even my own phrasing of that question was wrong, how we can force them to change their mind. They're not going to like that, because historically the Muslim world is not fond of the West. They've got some decent reasons for that, and some not so decent reasons for that. But the bottom line is they're not going to listen to us coming in telling them what to do. But what role can we play in winning that broader ideological struggle? Otherwise, you know, 20 years from now, you know, a new Armed Services Committee is going to be talking about some other country. I won't name one because I don't want to, you know, predict the future in that way, but it's going to just keep evolving and moving and moving and moving as long as this ideology is not defeated and is broadly acceptable. So what can we do to nudge it towards, well, if not disappearing, at least reducing?
Well, I'll take a run at it. You know, I have felt since 9/11 we've never had a comprehensive strategy to defeat radical Islam. I always felt the Bush administration made a strategic error in wanting us all to go back and watch the New York Yankees. I'm a hometown New Yorker, I apologize, not for the New York Yankees. But the fact is, we've never, ever dealt with the broader issue. And the reality is, yes, you're absolutely right. We have ISIS in front of us, just like we had core al-Qaeda in Pakistan, initially in Afghanistan, and there'll be somebody else after that if we don't come to grips with the larger issue itself. And that, I think, is a comprehensive strategy to deal with radical Islam. And
got that. What I'm asking for is that comprehensive strategy.
Yeah, I'm talking about.
What does it look like?
So if you look at a map and you see that radical Islam has morphed into a global jihad. It goes from Western Africa to Northeastern Africa, all through the Middle East, into Afghanistan, Pakistan, Southern Asia, and Southeast Asia, in very different degrees of depth and violence. But the one thing that they all have in common is a commitment to an ideology, the central point that you're making. Most of these movements are about overthrowing host country government because of the grievances that they have, but they use jihad to achieve those ends. So when I look at it, I mean, this is Fordham University Jesuit training, which you're familiar with, sir. And just take a logical approach. If you've got a global problem on your hands, what I think this is, we should have a global response to that problem. This isn't about just the United States. There's no way that we can deal with this problem without enlisting a global response to it. I think what we can do here is what we have historically done, is provide leadership. Not telling people how, but setting the framework and the stage to move forward in a global alliance to deal with this. And that is understanding the ideology. It is working against it. You know, I believe strongly that we're making a serious strategic mistake in not dealing with radical Islam and letting the moderate, when you understand what is the struggle is inside Islam, dealing with these, with the radicals who take a very literal interpretation of the Quran and the Prophet's writings, some of it going back to medieval times, as we know, and they're battling against the moderates and the traditionalists, which is the overwhelming majority. When we refuse to deal with this, the name of it, which I have less problem with, but more problem with explaining it and really laying out what this is, we permit the moderates and the traditionalists not to have to explain it themselves. They are the theologians here. We are actually dealing with people whose ideology is steep in theology. We need those clerics who are opposed to that radical theology to explain it, why this is wrong. And it doesn't get done. And that is a serious mistake, and we're tolerating that mistake. We should not let them off the hook in dealing with this. I think that's what al-Sisi was trying to do as a national leader, is to reach into them and to get their attention and say, this is our problem, but it's more your problem.
I'm sorry, that's a great answer. We've got a lot of other people to get into, to have an opportunity to ask questions. I'm sorry, gentlemen. If you have an answer to that, if you could submit it for the record, that'd be great. I want to let some other folks ask some questions. Thank you, General Keane.
And I just have to reflect that at least as far back as 2007 and 8, when Mr. Smith chaired what we now have Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee, and I was a ranking member, he was on this issue. How do we battle this ideology? Which I share the frustration of both of you. We really haven't been able to do that yet. Mr. Jones.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and I thank the panelists for being here today to talk about the President's AUMF. And I'd like to make a couple of points, and then probably, Dean Chesney, I'm going to come back to you. You know, the fact is it's so vague, and y'all have already commented on that, and whether it should be expanded beyond ISA as to what groups could be a threat, what groups need to be fought and defeated. Let me make that point. Also, the issue of sunset, whether it should be sunset or not. I was in the Congress. I've been here 20 years. I was here at 9/11. I was part of this committee at that time. I remember the anxiety of the American people, and also those of us in Congress, by the way, that we had to do something. We had to give President Bush the authority to fight this enemy that had done so much damage to America. So we passed the AUMF for 2001. And then a year or two later, we passed another AUMF for Iraq. Well, I bring that up because we are still there. If there had been a sunset with either of the two, do you think, Dean, that President Obama would have thought he had the authority to bomb Libya? Bob Gates, the Secretary of Defense, was sitting exactly where you are when my good friend Randy Forbes, who's now left the committee for another meeting, asked Secretary Gates if Libya had dropped a bomb on New York City, would that be an act of war? He never answered. He never answered it. So the point is that Mr. Obama did not come to Congress in any way to say to the Congress, this committee or any other committee, that we've got a problem with Gaddafi and Libya and we're going to attack. That's what's got the American people concerned, not just about Mr. Obama, but any president that has any type of authority that he or she can turn their nose up to the Constitution, and we are complicit as a Congress if we give them such authority that there are no limits to that authority, and actually there are no endpoint to the strategy that an administration, forget whether it's Obama administration or another administration, that we become complicit as members of Congress who uphold our hands and say we will support the Constitution of the United States, and we know the requirement of the Constitution as it reflects to war powers. So my question to you is that if these 2001 and 2002 had a sunset, do you think that Mr. Obama would have felt that he could bypass Congress and bomb a foreign country? Because my belief is, as a non-attorney, that if he had done that, then we get into international law, that I don't think any nation, as great as America is, should have the power to just decide to go in and bomb another country because we don't like their leadership. And so therefore, I think the AUMF needs to be vetted very carefully as we move forward. But I want to ask you, I've got a minute to give it to you, I want to ask you that if we had sunsetted those two AUMFs, do you think Mr. Obama would have felt he had the justification to bomb Libya?
Sir, you raised a number of great questions. If there had been sunsets for the 2001 and 2002 AUMFs, and if those moments came and for whatever reason those authorizations were not renewed so that they'd gone away, and we reached 2011 when, as we did, the administration deployed our military to use force in Libya, I actually don't think it would be any different than what actually happened, because at that time there was no claim by the administration that what it was doing in Libya was under color of either of the existing AUMFs. Instead, it was a pretty broad claim of Article II authority inherent in the president. So I think we would have seen that same claim being made, for better or worse. That claim does illustrate the breadth with which this administration understands its Article II authority to act without your participation to be. That was not a situation where there had been an attack on the United States, or at least that was being claimed as the basis for it. Instead, it was about the enforcement of the UN Security Council resolution, foreign policy interests that were very important, humanitarian interests that were important, but none of which are traditional bases for Article II claims of authority to deploy the military.
Thank the gentleman, and just to alert members and witnesses, because we're the largest committee in Congress, I have to be pretty strict about the time limit. So I appreciate your understanding on that. Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all very much for being here, for your service, particularly General Keane, and for your insights. I want to actually turn to something that maybe we have a little more control over, and that's the reporting mechanism. And Mr. Wittes, you talked about that. General Keane, you yourself mentioned in your remarks or in the article that we were 3 years into a failing strategy with the war in Iraq. And you talked about the adaptiveness, and I appreciate that in terms of our military. But I guess I'm looking for what language you think is appropriate in terms of the reporting mechanism to the Congress, because there are a few of us who were here at that time. And I don't know, how do you think we did? How did we do in terms of that oversight role? Because if we were 3 years into a failing strategy, had difficulty asking the questions, and frankly, a great deal of difficulty getting answers, what is it that we need to do now?
I'm very glad you asked that question, because I actually think the reporting requirements that the administration wrote into its draft AUMF should reasonably be regarded as insulting to probably less to the committees of jurisdiction than to the larger Congress and certainly to the public. For the last number of years, there's been a quiet but occasionally erupting tension between, you sometimes see it, I don't know if it's arisen on this committee, but it's certainly come up with your Senate counterparts, where people have wanted to get a list of groups that are covered by the AUMF. And the administration has actually not produced a list of groups that the AUMF authorizes force against. And I think this is kind of a mind-boggling thing, that you have a 13, 14-year-old war in which the position of the executive branch is that there is no, there is no public list of the group of people that we're at war with. So I think at a minimum, the reporting requirements should require public reporting of the list of organizations that the administration considers affiliates, associates, co-belligerents of the organizations that it's authorizing force against. One of the reasons to integrate the existing AUMF into the old AUMF is so that you can apply those reporting requirements to al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and their associated forces.
And in a way, I mean, we're saying associated forces, but not including persons, as in the 2001 as well.
Although there is some pretty broad language here about who counts as an associated force. But I'm saying, that's a separate fight. The question, once you've decided somebody is an associated force, who gets to know that, right? And I think the Congress should be advised of who's an associated force. And unless there's some compelling national security reason to keep it secret from the public, that should be provided in public form as well. Secondly, the administration's draft talks about, I don't have the language of it in front of me, but it talks about a semi-annual report or a twice-annual report on specific actions taken under the authorization. Now, again, there's no clarity about what specific actions mean, and there's some question if you have duplicative authorizations, whether you're taking it under this authorization or under the other one that doesn't have the reporting requirements. So I think that, in the draft that Professor Chesney and our co-authors and I wrote, we laid out what we thought were a sort of robust and reasonable set of reporting obligations. The text of that is in my prepared statement, and I still think those make sense, honestly.
Yeah, time is running out. Mr. Chesney, I appreciate that you would agree with that. General Keane, can you comment on the reporting and the role of the Congress, and again, these 3 years into a failing?
I don't have any problem with reporting requirements. I do believe the mechanism for oversight of military force being applied is already here, and your committee is central to that. I think it really has much to do with the rigor of that. The 3-year failed strategy we had in Iraq, I don't suggest that the committee probably would have uncovered initially that the strategy was not going to work. But I think when the evidence was there that it was not working, I think the committee does bear some responsibility to do thorough assessments. If these are the goals and objectives we're trying to achieve, how are we doing against these goals and objectives? And that kind of analysis was there, and it was evidence that the strategy was failing. So I think the mechanism is really already here. I think it has to do with rolling up the sleeves and doing rigorous assessment and analysis.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here today. And General Keane, I want to thank you for your service on cable news. It's always really so solid, the information you provide. It's so meaningful and so important to the American people. It's particularly meaningful to me. I have 4 sons currently serving in the military of the United States. And every time I see you on the air, it's a reminder to me of how capable and competent the American military is. And so I want to thank you for that. I also would like your input on what suggestions do you have for the AUMF, and what language should there be for the flexibility for our President to be able to lead us to victory?
Well, I think the language that we found in the other two AUMFs, excuse me, where we're talking about using the appropriate and necessary force, in a very short statement to that effect, is what really is appropriate. As I stated in oral statement, I don't believe we need to, nor should we have a time constraint in it. Why cast any doubt about our resolve? Why do that? This administration has a pattern of doing that in the past, as we recognized when the president, I think, rightfully made the commitment to escalate our forces in Afghanistan. In the same public policy statement, he announced the termination of that force as well. I think that is an unnecessary flag to our enemy about our lack of commitment, and I also think it does much the same with our allies. So I would avoid that for those reasons, and I do believe that given the authorities that Congress has and the oversight responsibilities, you can get at this another way. I would agree with Mr. Chesney that if you kick this thing down the road a little bit, a few more years, then some of that does go away in terms of the lack of resolve and commitment. But 3 years, I think, is unacceptable. The ground force constraint, I think, has to be absolutely removed because of what we're dealing with. We are facing an enemy that in the front of us we have to deal with largely militarily. At the same time, we're trying to counter their finances, undermine their ideology. But this right now is a central military problem. And we already know that the only way that we can defeat this force is with effective ground operations. So anything in this document that would cast doubt on our ability to conduct decisive and effective ground force operations seems to me to be misguided, and it should not be in the document. I would bow to Mr. Witt on the left, who knows far more about the intricacies of the legality of this than I do, but and the fact that the president would still have the authority, even though the appearance of it would be that he does not. I would not want that confusion. I don't want our troops to have that kind of confusion. It doesn't make any sense to me. And those are the essential issues for me. I'm for the president having the latitude to conduct military operations without these constraints on it.
And it does appear to be a limitation on ground troops, but with loopholes that certainly has to be of concern to the American people. And Dean Chesney and Mr. Wittes, it's been indicated that y'all have provided the language for AUMF. Has that been provided to the American people, and can you give a summary?
So this was written back in November in a post on Lawfare by the four of us. We had written a draft AUMF, a much more complicated draft, about a year and a half earlier than that. And so this was a response to some of the criticisms that we had received, and also a response to ISIL, which had emerged in the meantime. And what we tried to do was to authorize force against the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIL, and their associated forces. We did not have a ground force restriction, in which I don't think any of us particularly believed. And we did have a sunset restriction, a provision that was also 3 years. But I think there's a very simple solution to the problem of triggering, flagging for the enemy a lack of resolve. Make the thing longer and don't call it a sunset.
Thank you.
Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and a big thank you to you for conducting this hearing, and I understand another hearing coming up next week or thereafter on the military side of this, what might be necessary. We're doing exactly what we should be doing as members of Congress. In my view, it's absolutely essential for Congress to act. To use the 2001 or the 2002 AUMF as a reason for a new war, actually a war that was declared over in Iraq is, in my estimation, just dead wrong. And we have a responsibility. We represent the American people, 535 of us, plus one, the President. And we have the obligation to deal with this. Not easy, easier to duck, but it's our responsibility. With regard to the 2001 AUMF still being in place and a sunset, the 2001 AUMF proves the reason for a sunset. An unending war. Can't continue it. We've got to deal with this, and a sunset seems to me to be absolutely appropriate in that, and 3 years requires that the next presidential election be about war. And that's a really good thing for the United States to debate and to discuss. With regard to the issue of, and this is coming to a question, the issue of limitations of the use of boots on the ground, which the President says he wants to limit, but then writes in such a way as probably not limiting. Is there any debate between our two esteemed lawyers and General about the ability of Congress to use the purse to limit the use of ground troops? For example, no money for infantry brigades, army brigades, artillery, and et cetera, but perhaps money for special forces and the like. Is there any doubt about the ability of Congress to limit using the purse?
I don't think there's any serious doubt about that. I think amongst those who debate these war powers issues, one common touchstone is that the power of the purse, there's very little Congress can't accomplish with it. We can imagine a bizarre hypothetical where somehow that power is leveraged to say that the president's not the commander-in-chief, but instead fill in the blank will have command. But obviously nothing like that sort's being contemplated or talked about here. So as long as you're away from that core superintendent's function, I think the power of the purse gives you a lot of leverage if it can be used in a particular way.
Any debate about that amongst the
No debate for me. I mean, you've done it before. The Congress stopped the war in Vietnam. It unauthorized, no longer authorized our advisors, no longer authorized the use of air power, and that war ended. I think it's the most powerful mechanism that you actually have.
Yeah, no, I have nothing to add to that.
Well, given that, and given the debate, which will go on forever, about how you define boots on the ground or limitations on what can actually be done, it just seems to me that we could very simply say, you have the power to bomb, you have the money to bomb, you have the money to do special operations or all of the other things, but there is no money for the brigades, infantry, artillery, et cetera. And I think that's a good, clear way to limit it. It also gives this committee and the Congress the opportunity at any moment to change its mind and appropriate the money for those purposes. So we would be constantly and appropriately, therefore, engaged in the ongoing issue of the war and its outcome. The other issue that is, I think, one that we're going to have to deal with is this issue of limitation. As I said before, I think it's absolutely essential. 3 years is perfect, in my view. I know you disagree that maybe the next president ought not have to deal with it immediately. I strongly disagree that the next president must deal with this up front in the campaign, tell the American people whether they want war or not and how they would conduct it. The other issue is the geography here. We're going to go round and round on geography, and again, my personal view of this is it must be limited. And probably doing that by clearly stating who we are at war with. And a final point, and I guess this won't be a question, but rather a comment, and that is, General, you're absolutely correct about the ideological war that we must be engaged in also. It's not just going to be a military war. This is a question about ideology and our necessity of dealing with that reality. I thank you, gentlemen, for the clarity on the power of the purse.
Mr. Franks? Dr. Fleming?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. General Keane, one of my primary concerns above what is contained within the AUMF is the fact that I still don't know a clear and coherent strategy upon which we will use the AUMF. The President has not outlined. In fact, at one point, he even said we didn't have a strategy. So I have a deep concern about whatever the AUMF ends up being, what is going to be the strategy that goes along with that? I'd love to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, you know, I agree with you, and it's pretty frustrating about what is being said and also what is not being said. I think clearly, just dealing with ISIS and dealing with Iraq and Syria, what is the strategy to degrade and destroy, defeat's a much better word than destroy, ISIS? We are saying to ourselves that we have an Iraq strategy first, which is to reclaim the territory that is lost. To do that, we know we need ground forces to do it. The air power has largely stalled, effective air power has largely stalled ISIS offensive campaign. It's no longer really taking territory in any large way in Iraq. It has taken territory in Syria since the bombing campaign began. That's another story. We are depending on local indigenous forces to be that ground force. But then we also know that we have problems with this force. That it's not a homogeneous force. It's Peshmerga, Shia militia, it's Iraqi security forces, it's Sunni tribes. And we also know that we want air power to be effective. But we're not going to put any boots on the ground to help that force be more effective. My simple way of dealing with this, if you think you have a weak hand, do what you can to strengthen that hand. Mm-hmm. What we want to avoid doing is what the congressman from California would like to constrain the president from doing. We all want to avoid using combat brigades to go deal with this. We want these people, the Iraqis, to bear the burden of this, not us, on the ground. And you won't get anybody in the military signing up for sending large combat brigades in there. So, but that strategy, I think, is flawed because we're not providing enough assistance to this local indigenous force that is weak. And by that I mean is special forces who can go with them on the ground, forward air controllers to help them, significant amounts of Apache helicopters, AC-130 gunships, JSOC direct action forces to go kill leaders like we do in Iraq and Afghanistan very successfully, on the ground, I may say. And these are questions I think that you can ask the military leaders when they come forward. In Syria, sir, there is no ground force.
Okay, and I appreciate that. And
there is no strategy in Syria to defeat ISIS. We do not have a strategy to defeat ISIS in Syria.
So it really is kind of based on a fantasy ground force. I get that, yes, we want to stand up or re-stand up the Iraqi forces, and that might work. But in Syria, and now I believe ISIS has moved into Libya, you know, we voted last year for the Free Syrian Army. We still don't know who the Free Syrian Army that we are arming and training, which could take years, and it's small in number. Even the President himself said they were pharmacists and doctors. So the question here is, without leadership from the United States and without boots on the ground that we can trust from an army that is well-trained and well-equipped, how in the world does this vague strategy work?
Well, it's not going to work. We have a plan. We have a plan to reclaim the territory that was lost in Iraq and hopefully return the sovereignty of Iraq to its borders. There is a plan for that. But what you're not being told is that the strategy in Syria is really only to degrade ISIS and to contain it. Because that is really what's on the table. The Free Syrian Army, we lost the opportunity to help them when they had the momentum in Syria, right, and when they needed our help. They're down to several brigades. We're going to train 3,000 to 5,000 a year of new recruits. Heck, ISIL gets that in a few months. Mm-hmm. It doesn't even match. There's no reality to that strategy if you accept the President at his word that he intends to destroy ISIS. What he intends to do is degrade it in Syria, contain it, and defer that problem to his successor. Mm-hmm. That is the strategy in Syria.
Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I thank you for being here today, and of course, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing this hearing, this issue to our hearing. I'm encouraged by the fact that we're finally having this debate, because I think Congress failed last fall to not only have an honest discussion about our overall strategy to defeat ISIS, but we also failed to discuss the underpinning authorities for that strategy. I think regardless of where you come down on this issue, it's important that we have the discussion, so I'm glad that we're here. I want to, first off, just say that the paramount importance is to make sure that our troops who are sent into harm's way know that all of America is behind them. When they go to battle and they go to fight and they go to potentially lay down their lives for this nation, they need to know that we're behind them, and that we will be there to help provide them with the resources that they need to do the job that we ask them to do. That said, I think the AUMF is critically important. I actually voted against the repeal of both the 2001 and 2002 AUMFs in the past when they came up on the floor as amendments to NDAA and defense appropriations, not because I fully support them, but because there was no alternative at the time. Now that we're looking at this new alternative, I like the fact, the proposal that this new AUMF should subsume and we should get rid of the 2001, and I agree with that. What I do want to do is to drill down on the geographic boundaries portion of it, and specifically the Brookings Institution's proposal to, instead of having a geographic boundary, a legal boundary, one that is in conjunction with international laws for the use of force and sovereignty. So could you, is it Wittes or Witts?
Wittes.
I apologize.
No worries.
Mr. Wittes, could you sort of drill down on that for me a little bit? Let me just give you a specific example and see if I understand this correctly. This legal boundary would basically say to American commanders on the ground, whom we should trust, by the way, because we put them in charge, and they know what they're doing when it comes to the use of military force. So we're telling them that in Iraq and Afghanistan, because we have the cooperation of those nations' governments, you can be in there, you can do your job, but you can't go and invade Pakistan without coming to Congress and Congress authorizing that first, because we don't have the invitation of the government of Pakistan to come conduct operations within their territory. What does this do for countries or failed states? Places like Yemen, places like Somalia back in 2001. What does, if these guys are in Yemen, does this then put constraints on our military commanders and on our troops to not be able to go after ISIS forces in Yemen, for example?
So I've got 2 minutes to answer this question. I'm going to do my best.
You have the full 2 minutes.
So, look, what we said in the proposal was that Congress authorizes action in any location that military action would be appropriate and lawful under international law of sovereignty and the use of force. Now, in circumstances, for example, where you would implicate the President's Article II self-defense authorities, of course, he wouldn't have to rely on this authorization. So in the exigent, imminent defense situation, he can operate under his own authority to the extent that he needs to. There are two ways to satisfy the sovereignty barrier under international law. One is if you have the consent of the country in question. Yemen tolerates our conducting drone strikes against AQAP. Pakistan has sometimes permitted our use of drones to strike targets in Pakistan. That ends the sovereignty problem. The other way is that the U.S. position is that it has the authority to use force against a non-consenting, on the territory of a non-consenting state when that state is either unwilling or unable to contain and deal with the threat that it is emanating from its soil against us. And so what this would say is, if one of those two, if that's your position as the administration on your international authority to use force, if you're within it, then you're within Congress's blessing and authorization. But we're not giving you authorization to do stuff that would otherwise violate international law as you understand it.
Very good. Thank you very much.
It was impressive. Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, one of the things that we're being asked to do is to repeal the 2002 authorization for the use of military force. As you know, the 2002 AUMF, concerning Iraq, found that Iraq poses a continuing threat to the national security of the United States and international peace and security in the Persian Gulf region, and because members of al-Qaeda are known to be in Iraq. I would like your opinion because it would seem to me that even though that the Saddam Hussein regime has been removed from power, that the objectives in the 2002 resolution remain, protecting both the United States and Iraqi minority groups, as well as ending terrorism in Iraq. All of those objectives are still in doubt, and therefore it does seem that there may be a compelling legal rationale for keeping the 2002 AUMF in force, since the President obviously is finding that he has very broad authority under it currently. So do you believe that leaving the 2002 AUMF concerning Iraq in place would be a conflict, and would you recommend removing the text that repeals the 2002 AUMF? Any thoughts?
So when the administration revealed that it was relying on the 2002 Iraq AUMF as part of its basis for its operations in Iraq, this precipitated a lot of debate amongst folks about whether this is a persuasive claim under that authority. The objectives, as you say, the objectives of the 02 authorization are still present. The question is, the authorization was specific to the threat posed by Iraq. What do we mean by that? What's the best reading of that authorization? If it means threats to the United States that are emanating from within or that involve something happening within the borders of the state of Iraq, that's an argument for saying that it fits, and I guess that's the argument that the administration adopted. If it's read instead to mean that Iraq in 02, that's referring to Saddam Hussein's regime and the government of Iraq as the threat, then it doesn't fit well. And that was a view that was a little bit more plausible to me, but reasonable lawyers, including some of my colleagues on lawfare, we disagreed on this point. The interesting question today is there anything you get only with the 2002 authorization that isn't separately covered either by the 2001 authorization against al-Qaeda or a new authorization that this body may produce against ISIL? And I'm hard-pressed to think of what that might be. We'd have to imagine a situation in which force needed to be used against some entity that was not plausibly an associated force of ISIL nor an associated force of al-Qaeda. We might imagine falling into that category Shiite militias, Hezbollah, the groups that are on the Shiite, Iran-sponsored side of things. We're not, to the best of my knowledge, at least in the public record, we're not currently using force or contemplating the use of force against them. Indeed, in some respects, we're fighting in the same direction against ISIS with those entities. You can imagine, though, a situation where it does seem appropriate, a new fact pattern. In that circumstance, the President's Article 2 authorities would be ample to at least initially respond, and I think the wiser course would be to come back to this body at that point if something more than Article 2 were needed.
Other thoughts? Any other thoughts on the panel?
I mean, I very much agree with that.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to start by thanking you and the ranking member for holding this hearing. I can think of no more important decision that we will make as members of Congress than whether or not to send our armed forces into harm's way. And I appreciate the fact that we've got the subject matter experts before us to help us make a more informed decision. I hope that we will have more hearings on this subject. It certainly warrants it. And I also want to agree with the fundamental questions asked by the chairman. You know, what is our strategy? And the ranking member, how do we help out without making the problem worse? I think those are the questions of the day, and I realize very difficult to answer. General Keane, I couldn't help but agree with you when you said that we shouldn't put limitations on our military if we're asking them to go in and do a very difficult job. If we want to acknowledge that there are no ground forces today in Syria that we can rely on, it's very questionable whether there are ground forces in Iraq that we can rely on that are not our own. And so if we're going to go in and if we want to win, then we need to do whatever is necessary to do that. But I also think about the service members at Fort Bliss, whom I have the honor of representing, the veterans who've come back from wars throughout our history, including the most recent engagements in the Middle East. And while I agree with Ms. Duckworth that they want to know that we have their back and that we support them, I think what they want to know even more than that is that we have a plan and we have a strategy before we send them into harm's way. So I'd like to ask you to do this. I don't know that in the 3 minutes remaining we can define what that strategy should look like. If you can, go for it. But how about this? Can you define what winning looks like? Can you define the conditions that would be necessary in Iraq and Syria or vis-a-vis ISIS for us to conclude military operations? And I'll start with General Keane, and then we can move to your left across the panel.
Well, ISIS is a little different organization than Al-Qaeda because owning territory provides them a legitimacy, and it's part of their belief system. So you fundamentally, to defeat them, have to begin by taking their territory away from them. They will largely stay and fight. We found that when we went into Afghanistan, where Al-Qaeda was initially at post 9/11, when they were met with some sizable force, not necessarily a decisive force, they ran to the mountains and hills of Pakistan. They fled to fight another day. This organization will not do that. So what we must do is take the territory away from them, which provides them their legitimacy. And by returning Iraq to its sovereignty, to its borders, that is a good thing, and that's what winning looks like. The same thing in taking the territory away from them in Syria. That would not stop ISIS from conducting terrorist activities in those same countries from outside the country or from a small safe haven in it, or using terrorist activities and cyber terrorism, which they're also doing in other satellite countries. But where core ISIS is, we must take the territory away that they own, and that begins to look like we're winning. That doesn't mean ISIS goes away, because as the map I showed you, they have affiliates out there and satellites that they're trying to establish governance with and relationships with. But this is central to ISIS. And let's face it, ISIS has quite an appeal in the world today. And why is that? Because they have the appearances of winning. They're standing up to the United States and powerful nations. They're humiliating these nations by the barbarism and butchery that they do on the internet. And they have had some impact with citizens in other countries, killing their fellow citizens as well. When you start to take this territory away from them, and you start to kill and capture them, and you find them in shackles, and they're moving into detention centers by the scores, this image, this attractiveness of ISIS begins to fade, because now it's a losing organization. And it starts to impact on its ability to recruit people. Nobody wants to be a part of a losing, failing organization.
Yeah, I'm not going to have time to hear from the other witnesses, but I would love to get your responses for the record. What does winning look like? What conditions will have to prevail for us to withdraw military forces from that region? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Keane, Mr. Chesney, Mr. Wittes, thanks so much for joining us today. General Keane, I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, in examining all the issues around an authorization to use of military force, what would be some of the questions that you would suggest that we ask of our military leaders with all the conditions that have to be considered here? The controversy of time frames, the extent of how we identify the adversary, how we go after them, what should the scope and breadth of that be? Give me your perspective on some of the aspects that we should get the military leaders' perspective on.
Certainly. Well, first of all, I think you're bringing General Alston in here, CENTCOM commander. I've known him for years, worked with him, a very fine officer, and certainly with his depth of experience, I think you're going to get all the answers you want. But here's a couple of suggestions. Number one, we're so dependent on this indigenous force in Iraq. I mean, it's appropriate to find out, get an assessment of the quality of that force and its reliability. After all, we did see this Iraqi army, despite all the years of investment in it, painfully watched it collapse in the face of ISIS, which wasn't that much of an overwhelming force. The Iraqi army outnumbered ISIS somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 1, but yet it collapsed in the face of it. So what has happened in the last year or so that changed that? This is crucial to our success. And what could we do as the coalition, not just the United States, to help that force be better, not just in training, but advising it and also giving it military capability to assist in that force? What kind of time frame are we really talking about here? Is this sometime this year, as the media seems to be reporting, and also CENTCOM gave us an awful lot of information on that, that themselves, which I was a little surprised with in terms of the qualitative approach and quantitative approach to the force itself. But that's an important issue. In dealing with Syria itself. Oh, let me come back to Iraq. One of the key dimensions in Iraq is clearly the Sunni tribes. And where are we in the growth and development of the Sunni tribes' willingness to participate under arms? And I know we're conducting some assistance of them. Most of them are reconcilable, and we know these leaders very well from our association with them. There's a few irreconcilables from the previous Saddam Hussein regime, and they're supporting ISIS. They always will. Where are we with that and the Abadi government's willingness to be politically inclusive with them? Another issue deals with Shia militia itself. The Shia militia is a very strong force. The cleric Sistani asked for popular support for it. It goes well close to 100,000 plus, maybe close to 200,000 volunteers who have thickened the Iraqi security forces. The best of the Shia militia forces are those that are backed by the Iranians and have had a role in training them. What does this mean to us as we go forward in terms of the Shia militia's role in helping to reclaim territory? Also, are we finally equipping the Peshmerga with what they need? They've been complaining to every one of you and to anybody that visits them that they still haven't got the equipment they need. In Syria, the real issue, as I've tried to point out, is the ground force itself. What will be the ground force that will eventually defeat ISIS in Syria? And I think if the answer is the Free Syrian Army, I think you need to push pretty hard on that, because it doesn't seem to be viable to me. I believe it's an Arab coalition that will have to be put together. They'll probably ask us to lead it, and I think it's likely we probably should. I don't think we could do that unless we shut down Assad's air power. And I also believe that the administration doesn't want to do any of that. And even though Turkey, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan want the administration to do that, in other words, shut Assad's air power down so that finally we can start to do something against ISIS and you're not bombing the Free Syrian Army force every day. That's what he's doing. I think the elephant in the room there, quite frankly, is the nuclear deal with Iran. That the administration does not want to push on Assad because of the relationship with Iran. Iran propped that machine up. It rescued that regime from failure. And if we pushed on it, I think it would jeopardize the pending potential deal on nuclear weapons, which I think the administration believes is its #1 priority. Probably wouldn't say that, but I believe it is. I don't think General Austin will get much involved in that because that's a policy question above his head. But certainly these other things, he'll be prepared to answer, and I think you'll get some very straight answers from him.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Norcross.
Thank you, Chairman. Certainly appreciate it. And, you know, one of the duties that we have is to make decisions on these very difficult items, and it weighs heavily, certainly on my mind and those of the people that I represent. Certainly, I have to agree with the witnesses when they talk about the 3 reasons that we're even considering this. Obviously, the moral reason, which I agree with, the age and the scope of the old AUMF, and certainly it's our job, which actually brings me to the point of the question. King Abdul was here 2-3 weeks ago, and it was the day that the video was released of his pilot being burned to death in a cage, that barbaric He stated, "This is our war," indicating that he and his partners in the Gulf, it can't be America against them. We need your help, but it's our war. And the other item, which really resonates with me, I've been fighting this for 1,400 years, and brings me back to what Mr. Smith had said, is beating down the moles. So we heard the question earlier talking about what is a win. And certainly the nuts and bolts of a win can be debated. But I think those who we are targeting, it's not a team sport that they win and lose. It's a way of life. And I think we've heard ample evidence of that, that they're willing to give everything up because they believe in this at a core level. Whether we think it's insane or not is immaterial. But you had talked rather general, directly against the time frame. Couldn't the same argument be spoken about the time frame as each year we authorize a budget? In many ways, that is a time frame. I think it is the responsibility of the next president and next Congress to review what we're doing. And I don't think anybody in this room or in America doubts the resolve of the American people to back up our troops. So I want to get your opinion on where we're going with the time frame again, given that at any point they could point to the fact that we wouldn't fund this through a budget and appropriations. How is that different than the resolve of a 2 or 3 year AUMF?
Well, in my mind, I mean, the budget is an annual process, and that's quite different. Even though there's plenty of authorities in the budget, obviously, to fund military operations. But that's quite different from the AUMF, where you're authorizing military force for a specific purpose, and then tying a time frame to that authorization. I'm suggesting that why do that when you have plenty of authority yourselves in your normal oversight of the Department of Defense and the executive branch to make certain that you understand what has taken place and the progress that has taken place, and you have the power of the purse in any event, which is your ultimate authority. I think it sends a message of a lack of resolve. You know as well as I do that our friends in the region, and if you're speaking to them, you know what I'm about to say, that they have been questioning America's resolve in this region for some time now.
Exactly why we're here today.
And why add to that? Why add to that doubt about our resolve? After all, we are going to be largely depending on them dealing with this problem for years to come. And secondly, I think it sends a message to the enemy that, well, America's not that serious. We're going to take another look at this in 3 years and see if we should be doing this. When anybody who's looking at this, I mean, the reason why we have an authorization for military force is because I think it's an unstated, it's an unstated understanding that it will be protracted, that this is going to go on for years.
Issue that we would be discussing each year. Couldn't they look at that from the very same perspective as you're suggesting?
That the normal oversight that takes place and the tough questions that are asked of you know, the Department of Defense leadership, both civilian and military, that kind of rigorous analysis is never going to get communicated to the same way that the authorization for military force and the time constraint that's associated with it would be. I mean, that's the headline. And rigorous analysis in terms of the progress we're making is not. I think those are two very different things and quite separate, frankly.
Thank you.
Mr. Franks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here. General Keane, I don't ever want to let a general stand before this committee without expressing gratitude for your service and for just your commitment to protect human freedom, especially my little babies. I appreciate it. I was especially moved by your comments related to the resolve that I think the enemy tries to consider as much as anything else. And the administration's AUMF mentions using American forces, quote, in support of partners on the ground and local forces to combat ISIS. One of my concerns is that there's an ancillary effect that it might end up where we're even indirectly funding Shia militia proxies of Iran, and it might actually increase their standing in the world to the extent that it might actually increase their opportunity to one day gain a nuclear weapons capability. And do you think that the AUMF, as it stands now, opens us up to the potential of the ancillary effect of fighting alongside Iran?
Well, clearly, we cannot disguise the fact that there are Shia militias largely protecting Baghdad and also the shrines, the Shia shrines, north and south, that are present there, and some of them have been trained by the Iranians. And they also have been effective, and they will continue to be effective. So that reality is on the ground, and it's not going to change. That does not mean that when Iraq gets its total territory back and its sovereignty is returned to its borders, that Iran is going to have a grip on Iraq that's totally dysfunctional. The Iraqis don't want that. Certainly Abadi wants no part of that. He also did not turn down, his predecessor didn't turn down, when he asked for help, airplanes started arriving day one. And we put off help for a few months, if you recall that. And he was not about to turn that help down from a practical matter. But when you look at it geopolitically, Iraq wants to stand on its own 2 feet. Iran will always have an influence there, given its neighbor, and also given the fact that they've helped them here. But I do think that the coalition that's coming together to help Iraq and to return its sovereignty, we will have a long-term strategic relationship with Iraq on a path that we had intended to do back in 2009, when we had driven this al-Qaeda in Iraq into their rat holes. So I think those opportunities are still there. I don't think that the Shia militia backed by the Iranians forecloses on a strategic relationship with Iraq over the long term that makes sense to us in terms of a country that has wealth, an educated class of people, and is a force for stability in the region. Those opportunities are still there.
Well, thank you. It occurs to me that emphasizing our relationship to the Kurds and helping them as much as possible might be a safer alternative there. But one of the great concerns that I think all of us have is that one of the gentlemen mentioned here, we've been fighting this radical Islamist ideology for 1,400 years. And so without defining our enemy or essentially by that ideology, it's difficult for me to know how that we engage them strategically. I mean, we've fought terrorism tactically very successfully. We've had unprecedented success, but I think that we've failed to engage them strategically. And so I guess I'd ask, what would your thoughts be to some language in an AUMF that might sort of, I know it's deep water, but to holistically identify this ideology so that we're able to confront it where it emerges, instead of just kind of coming up with some fuzzy associational definitions?
You know, I sympathize, with your desire to do that, because you're frustrated like I am that we don't have a comprehensive strategy to deal with this, and it's gone on far too long. And when you watch the continued growth of al-Qaeda, and now watching the growth of ISIS, it's particularly difficult to recognize that we still haven't come to grips with it. But this is not the document to put those means in there. even though you're frustrated and you're tempted to want to do that. It's just inappropriate to do it. I think it would set a terrible precedent for authorizing military force. I think you'd get significant pushback from and justifiably so, from the president and his team. I think bringing the national leadership in here and putting them in front of you and asking them to explain what is the strategy to deal with radical Islam and evaluating that and assessing that and pushing on them, I think that's much more appropriate to deal with than to try to put some expression of it in this document, in the authorization for military force. I think it's inappropriate.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Takei.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and really thank you very much for having this hearing. As many have mentioned, this is a very important issue for all of us here and definitely for our constituents back at home. I looked at the request from the President in the form of this joint resolution, and under Section C, limitations, it says the authority to grant does not authorize the use of the United States Armed Forces in, and I quote, enduring offensive ground combat operations. So my question to you on the panel is, what does that mean? Does it actually refer to the length of time during which the operations will be ongoing for 3 years? What is the scope of the operation from your perspective? And is it, in fact, some undefined relationship between time and scope?
It's not well defined. It's a severe problem with the language in Section 2C, and it's not just one problem of lack of clarity. It's multiple problems. Enduring has no particular legal meaning. That, in some people's minds, could reasonably refer to years. In other people's minds, the Secretary of State the other day, on Tuesday, referred to a couple of weeks or a few weeks. Well, reasonable people can disagree about what enduring means. Offensive is difficult to describe. So, for example, the upcoming operation to liberate the city of Mosul, is that an offensive operation? You can see where someone would view it that way. But on the other hand, it's not like ISIL was in that city all along. ISIL came in and took it. Is it defensive to drive them back out? Ground combat. If you have forward air controllers who are on the ground and are directing airstrikes or assisting with the direction of airstrikes, is that a ground combat operation? There's ways to try to handle this by offering statements like the President's transmittal letter referring to, well, here's a list or an enumeration of particular types of activities that we mean to be okay. But at the end of the day, none of that gets enacted in the AUMF. The AUMF's text will say no enduring offensive ground combat operations, and that language should be dropped.
Okay, thank you. I have another question, and maybe you can help me with this. So there's been many mentions. I mean, if you take a look at the language, it also repeals the 2002 AUMF. But my reservations are in regards to the still in effect 2001 AUMF. So my question is, and in fact, many people have already said it, the conflict that we're in right now, what's happening right now is based on the 2001 and 2002 AUMF. So what is your perspective with the fact that the 2001 AUMF will still be in effect based on this draft? What does that mean? I mean, we're currently operating with those two AUMFs. Is, in fact, this particular draft necessary to continue operation?
Well, so what it means very simply is that the additional authorization here is purely additive, not, there's no, the interaction between this and the underlying document is that this merely adds authority. It does not tailor authority. It doesn't really, despite the optics, at least as a legal matter, it doesn't limit authority. And I think if I have one message for this committee, it is think about the new authorization in interaction with the prior authorization, because otherwise you end up talking about restrictions that aren't real restrictions, and you also end up imposing you end up doing all kinds of things that you don't know you're doing or you don't mean to be doing because there are these other documents out there. And so think about it as though you had to today answer the question, what force do we want to be authorizing overseas in general against the groups that we might want to use force against? And some of that involves rewriting the old AUMF, and some of it involves the discrete expansion of it into the ISIL and Associated Forces Department. But think about that question holistically. Don't try to think about it as, hey, what can we add that's on ISIL in particular, because then you end up with restrictions that don't seem to mean what they say.
Okay, and then one more question, and I guess we'll have to wait for your response in writing. But I'm just questioning why you think there was no geographical limitations put in this current draft. So if you can think about that and maybe just send us the information. I
can give you a 2-second answer to that because the administration wanted to maintain flexibility.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. And the authorization that the President submitted to Congress lists one terrorist group in 2 countries. I've got a Defense Intelligence Agency report right here that's unclassified that says that we're chasing 41 terrorist groups in 24 countries. And I think that one of my concerns, or I know one of my concerns, and I think other people's concerns with the way the authorization is drafted is what if they simply change their name, or what if they simply cross borders into another country. The other thing that I would point out is that the President had the authority several months ago when we first saw the ISIL convoys to take action at that stage, and he chose not to. And I think that one of the reasons that we're in the situation we are today is because they were indecisive at that point. And quite honestly, it's almost like they let them kill enough people that now all of a sudden they have to do something about it. I want to go back to 2011 for a second. The decision was made to take Gaddafi out, yet the United States did not secure the weapons in Libya. I would like to know what do you think happened to the weapons in Libya when Gaddafi was removed, since we did not go into the country and secure them? The other thing I would suggest is that the U.S., through the State Department, for years has been undermining Assad and the central government of Syria. That, to me, seems to have been one of the things that has allowed these terrorist groups to grow. And then finally, I would like, in general, this may be more of a question for you because of your military experience. What does the hold force look like? I have no idea that we can move these terrorists out of any territory that we choose to move them out of. But what does the hold force look like to hold that territory? Because if we can't hold it this time, we're simply going to be right back in there again.
Okay, well, that's a mouthful. Let me try to deal with some of it and hopefully leave some time for others. But, in terms of the enemy itself, I think saying ISIS and also putting the word associates in there clearly sends a message that this is ISIS, as I tried to show you on ISW's map, clearly has intent and is moving outside of ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, which is essentially the Levant. And you would not want to restrict the president geographically or in terms of what this enemy calls itself and who it's affiliated with. It doesn't mean that on that map that's in front of you that we would obviously be dealing with ISIS in all of those countries. I think we'd have to give the president a lot more credit than that. But the fact of the matter is, if we wanted to conduct a counterterrorism operation against ISIS in Libya, because the Sisi asked us to do that, we want to do it together, and we've got good reason to do it, that may be something the president would want to consider, and we would want him to have the flexibility to do that.
Do you agree that he has the authorization to do that today?
He could do it today.
Absolutely, I agree with you.
I agree with that, but I also think that this document, because this is a protracted war, And because of who this enemy is and the scale of it, I do believe the AUMF is appropriate. In weapons in Libya, look at, 3 times we have made the same mistake. We went into Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, deposed a government, and never had very good plans to deal with the aftermath of that in terms of establishing security and stability. We have made the same mistake 3 times. In Libya, the only thing that, and we had a moderate government that took over, much to our surprise. The only thing that moderate government asked of us is help me put together an effective security force so I can tamp down the militant organizations that are in my country. Our answer to that was no. And look where we are now. Our embassy is gone. They've killed our ambassador. They burned our consulate down. And we've got chaos in that country. The weapons in Libya, we did take control. I mean, I can't get into the classified aspect of it. The Central Intelligence Agency did have an operation that they conducted in Libya to take control of a lot of sensitive weapons. I'm not talking about AK-47s and RPGs. I'm talking about WMD and other weapons.
I'm out of time. I would suggest that a better word for what happened to our ambassador in Libya was an assassination. The idea that that just kind of happened is absolutely ridiculous, and the facts show that that was an absolute assassination of the United States ambassador.
Quickly, on the hold force, if all we do is clear out ISIS from Mosul to Crete and Fallujah and don't have a force that stays there to protect it and is effective, this is the #1 lesson we learned prior to putting in play the counterinsurgency operations in Baghdad and the environs around it. We would routinely clear forces out, and then they would come back in because we did not hold control of the territory and maintain influence and control over the people. If we don't do that, they for certain are going to come back. This is a determined, resolute force. They're not going to go someplace else. They're going to come back. And we have to have that capability there. And I think that's something you can explore with General Alston. I'm sure he's got a plan for it.
Ms. Gabbard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. There's so many different points and angles and difficult to address them quickly in less than 5 minutes. But I want to touch on the point that many have made about the need to address and come up with an effective strategy to defeat this threat, not only militarily, but simultaneously ideologically. That, as you said, General Keane, as we saw with al-Qaeda, because this was never addressed up front, we find ourselves in the situation that we're in today. So my question is about how we deal with this issue within the construct. Each of you believe that there should be an AUMF passed to deal with this, and how that issue of ideology is addressed within this document. And secondly, as we talk about what's coming in Mosul, but also generally as we look at the military strategy to defeat this enemy, why it's so important to address the ideology is, for example, if we had a primarily U.S.-led ground force, it would play directly into the ideology and major recruiting propaganda that groups like ISIS are using, that this is a war between the West and Muslims, as opposed to supporting what President al-Sisi is calling for, this Arab regional ground force. So specifically with the AUMF, I wonder if you can address that question with regards to the fact that this must have a military and ideology component to the strategy. You can start with General Keane.
Well, you know I have very strong feelings about the fact that we have to recognize it for what it is. What we fail to do is name the movement properly. Then we don't define it, and we certainly have done a terrible job in explaining its ideology. And by putting a magnifying glass on that ideology and then having the moderate and the traditionalist Muslims explain why the Islam that they're following is powerful and why 95, 97% of the Muslims in the world are following it, and why that should shape and define people's lives, and why this this other following is absolutely antithetical to it. That has to take place, and I would suggest that we are not the best to do that. This is about Muslims doing this, educating not only Muslims about it, but educating the rest of us about this. And I do think the United States can play a leadership role here in terms of encouraging this and getting the majority of the Muslims, and there's many of them that speak out, but getting their clerical leaders to really speak out in a theological way to deal with this issue. Certainly, the military component here is what is right in front of us. We have a marauding enemy that is killing people every single day. Most of it is not being exposed on the internet. And this kind of brutality and barbarism has to be stopped. The only way you can stop that killing is you have to kill the people who are doing it, or you have to capture them. All that said, we don't want to fight another movement like this 5 years from now or 8 years from now, and that's what brings in your comment about the ideology and countering that entire narrative. We need a longer-term issue to get at that. And yes, there are conditions in this region that help to grow some of this movement. There is political reform, social justice, and some of the economic repression in the region are conditions that contribute to it. They're not necessarily central to it, but they're there contributing to it. And we have to have those kind of sensible dialogues with our friends in the region who in fact contribute to some of these problems.
Right. Sorry, I've got 1 minute. I wanted to just ask Mr. Chesney both to address this, but also the first point that you made about this AUMF lacking a purpose, a directly stated purpose, and how you could see that an effective winning strategy can be achieved and outlined really in this.
So taking these in reverse order, it certainly makes sense to talk about the strategy on the ground, most likely being best effectuated by an Arab regional ground force, properly supported and led and resourced and punched up by U.S. forces, trying to tweak the AMF's language in a way that allows for that, yet doesn't somehow allow for a larger ground force where it's just the U.S., I think is not going to be easily done and shouldn't be attempted. That should be left to the commander-in-chief to figure out how to do this without trying to tie his hands legislatively. As to what you say about the purpose, very difficult to make a granular statement there, but there needs to be at least some guidance at a high level of generality.
Thank you.
Mr. Brooks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. During my time, I'd like to emphasize the very broad nature and scope of the war resolution that we're being asked to support. In particular, and this has been mentioned by some of the other congressmen and by the witnesses, there are no geographic limitations. And as I understand it from the information I have, you can make the case that the Islamic State is active, of course, in Iraq and Syria, but also Jordan, Libya, Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and other nations. Under the war resolution that we're being asked to support, in Section 2 it states, the President is authorized to use the armed forces of the United States as the President determines to be necessary and appropriate against ISIL or associated persons or forces as defined in Section 5. You go down to Section 5. The term associated persons or forces means individuals and organizations fighting for, on behalf of, or alongside ISIL, which is, as we know, covering virtually every continent on Earth with the possible exception of Antarctica and many of the countries that are on each of those continents, because the Islamic State has done a fairly good job of recruiting its people from all corners of the globe. In that vein, then, I want to emphasize a couple of questions, but ask you to ask one of them. First, how is America going to pay for it? This is an extraordinary cost, and we've had witnesses where you're sitting now who have already said that the greatest national security threat that the United States of America faces is our deficit and accumulated debt that ultimately has the potential of exposing us to a devastating insolvency and bankruptcy, which would eliminate our ability to have a national defense. Those words, in effect, came from Admiral Mike Mullen when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Second, how does diversion of defense money to this effort to fight the Islamic State undermine our defense capabilities and the rest of the needs for America's national security. The question I want you to answer, though, is if Congress adopts this war resolution or a similar one, how does that action affect the willingness of the rest of the world, and Europe in particular, Germany, France, United Kingdom, Italy, and the like, to shoulder more of the burden, to spend their treasury, to risk the lives of their young men and women, now that they know that the United States of America is once again willing to pay the price for the world's security. So if we pass this war resolution, how does that impact the willingness of other nations that are at risk to spend their money and risk their young men and women?
I mean, I think I'm overwhelmingly unqualified to address any of those questions, frankly. I am not an expert on fiscal matters. I'm actually not an expert on European-U.S. relations. And, you know, you guys asked me to address the merits of the president's proposal, and I've tried to give some technical guidance on that.
I appreciate your succinctness and candor in that regard, and maybe the other two witnesses are not prepared either, but if we're going to shoulder the whole burden, which is what this resolution seems to suggest we're willing to do, how does that affect the willingness of other nations to sacrifice as we would be sacrificed?
Well,
General Keane?
I knew we were going to have this discussion. And I think it's very difficult to put a price tag on security of the American people. We know this is a threat to our interests and national security objectives in the region, and we know it pretends to be a long-term threat to the American people. This ideology is clearly having some impact. I'm not suggesting for a minute that terrorism is going to break out across the United States. I don't wring my hands about things like that. But I do take seriously when a director of the FBI said he's got homegrown terrorism investigations going on in every state in the United States. I'm not suggesting that there's going to be a terrorist act in every state, that every one of those people who he's investigating have the means to do it or the will to do it, but just the fact that it's ongoing itself, I think is alarming in and of itself, that how many people have been attracted to this ideology. So secondly, the security of American people are involved here. And should we be prudent about the expenditure of funds to do this? Of course we would be. But one of the things we have to do, to be frank about it, Mr. Congressman, is we have to deal with sequestration. While we're talking about the authorization of military force, the Budget Control Act is decapitating the capabilities of the United States military. And you know that as well as I do when these service chiefs come in front of you and lay out, you know, what their challenges are as they look down the road at the Budget Control Act or sequestration. We're taking the Army down to something that's pre-World War II and the Navy and the Air Force down to something that's 1950s. That doesn't make any sense to anybody. But that's the path that we're on. So I think the Congress can play a significant role here in dealing with sequestration. Europeans, listen, the Europeans, I don't think they've ever recovered from the fact we bailed them out of from post-World War II. Year after year after year, they have pushed the burden of their security more on us. And this has been generational. Many of these European nations are feckless in the face of real security challenges. You can see it in their budget, and you can see it in their will. And look at how they're dealing with Putin and the redesign of Europe that he's imposing on them, and the feckless response that they were getting from them. It's predictable that we will, by comparison to our European friends, bear a greater burden. I think it goes with the leadership role the United States plays in the world, that the United States believes in stability and security and helping to raise the prosperity level among people in the world and dealing with the thugs and killers that are out there who would impose our will. And it's not that we'd have to be the answer to all of it, but where our national interests are involved, that we should be involved. And we shouldn't judge that based on, look around and say, are our European friends going to be with us or not? We should do everything to get them involved with us. But if they choose to be half-hearted about it, if our interests are at stake and the security of American people at stake, then I think we got to be there. And I don't think you put a price tag on it.
Mr. Moulton?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here this morning. General Keane, I want to specifically thank you because as an infantry officer in the surge, I'm greatly appreciative of what you did to help turn that war around. I respectfully disagree with an earlier statement one of my colleagues made that the most important thing for the troops on the ground is to know that all of America is behind them. I knew that all of America wasn't supportive of what I was doing in Iraq, but you, with the help of General Petraeus and others, gave us some hope, some faith that we had a plan, that our effort, our sacrifice, our loss would not be in vain. And so I, among many others, come back to this fundamental issue that we don't seem to have a strategy here. I just returned from a CODEL to Iraq and Afghanistan and received countless briefs on a three-phase plan. And we all know that Phase 4 was what was missing back in 2003, and it seems like it's missing again here. I've not seen a good plan to deal with the Sunni tribes, to deal with the Shiite militias, and that's just in Iraq. I agree with your assessment that we don't seem to have much of any plan at all for Syria. So my question is, how do you try to influence this debate to actually get a strategy? Somehow you were able to take a failing war in Iraq and help turn it around by bringing a workable strategy into the discussion and then eventually getting it enacted. If you could comment on that, maybe we could see a path forward.
Well, thank you, and appreciate your service as well. Semper Fi. This is very difficult to change the failing strategy in Iraq. To be frank about it, the military leaders who are prosecuting that strategy did not want to change. The leaders of the Department of Defense also, civilian leadership, the senior military leaders in Washington did not want to change. But I think what happened there is it appeared to me that the evidence was compelling that the strategy was not working. And I think we had one person that understood that was willing to do something about it, and that was the President of the United States. I mean, he just instinctively saw it and said, this is a real problem. I don't think he knew necessarily what should be done about it, but he knew instinctively we had to do something about it, and he threw politics aside, certainly, because his own party was almost as much against him as the opposition party was, and certainly most of his generals were. But he reached for something that turned out to be the right answer. So this is very hard to do. We have a different problem here, I think, is we have a strategy that we've put together, and it's in the beginning of its execution. And so it's very difficult to get someone to change it based on the fact that when you look down at it long term, it's not going to work.
Mr. Chesney, do you have anything to add to this?
No, I'll simply say that it'll be difficult to make any progress on this through the lens of the AUMF itself. But the right way to think about the AUMF's relationship to this question is to make sure that the Commander-in-Chief has the authority that he may judge necessary and not to tie his hands. Even if he's asking for you to tie his hands shouldn't be tied.
Well, I agree with that statement, and I think that what was most frustrating to me about returning to Iraq was seeing so much of the effort that we had carried out during the surge really gone to waste. And the operative question in my mind is not how do we have a military strategy to defeat ISIS? I think we do. The question is, how do we prevent what happened from 2010 to 2013, where all that effort went to waste? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time.
Thank you. Mr. Gibson.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the panelists, and want to begin just by associating myself with the remarks that General Keane made earlier today
with regard to calling things for what they are, Islamic extremists. And I've been saying this for some time. First of all, it's the reality. The second point is that it really then lays bare what our enemy is trying to do. This extremist group, this Islamic extremist group, is trying to deceive the Muslim world that somehow they're advancing their cause. This is how they're trying to recruit and fundraise. So when we label it as it is, we lessen their ability, especially now when you see Muslim nations and people standing up to this Islamic extremism in Iraq, Kurds, and then Jordan and Egypt. When we're supporting them, we lessen our enemy's ability to recruit and fundraise. And that's the key point here. We can militarily engage at this moment, and for every one that we kill, we end up dealing with issues of multipliers in terms of recruiting and fundraising. Why it's so important to have clarity. So I just want to associate myself with those remarks. My question for the panel has to do with, and by the way, I want to thank General Keane. He's always been a source of inspiration and great mentorship to many of those in uniform. My question's on Syria. Last fall, I was not able to vote for arming the so-called Syrian, moderate Syrian army. I gave it a fair hearing. I looked at all the briefings and looked at the briefing papers, and at the end of the day, I believe that that force was militarily incompetent, politically untrustworthy, and it was going to fail. So that put me in ethically, morally, I felt in a tough spot because I knew that this is an enemy that can't be deterred. They have to be defeated. Question is how, and we were proposing a strategy that was, in my view, going to fail, and now we're seeing the problems of it. How do we get anything done of significance in Syria without a political foundation? In Iraq, you could argue about the efficacy of that foundation, but you have Iraq, the Kurds, you have a foundation from which to support, take concerted action. In Syria, we have really no foundation. So what's the way forward there from anyone in the panel? Very interested to hear.
Well, I'll take a stab at it. Syria is really a tough problem, and there are very good arguments on both sides, on many sides of this issue, because it is so challenging. I just want to provide you a couple of data points. Remember back when this was part of the Arab Spring, the people stood up against Assad, and because he was so violently, he used violence to push the people back. Many of his officers and his troops that underneath him joined the opposition forces because he was killing his own people in the streets, unlike what took place in Egypt. As a result of that, that opposition force gained momentum, and people in this town were predicting it was just a matter of time before Assad falls. Remember that? And what happened is the Iranians came in, propped up the regime, so did the Russians, and then the Free Syrian Army asked for our help. And this goes back in the 2011 timeframe. In 2012, ISIS moves into Syria. And would things have been different if we had helped the Free Syrian Army then to maintain that momentum against the regime? I think so. I don't know for sure. But I think we made a huge policy mistake. And then in 2012, Clinton, Petraeus, Panetta, and Dempsey advocate the same thing as a matter of policy, not just the Free Syrian Army asking. Now they're advocating it, and we say no again. But in 2012, the radical Islamists are in Syria, and they're growing in size and scale and adding to the complications of this problem. What they do, they didn't start the Arab Spring, but they have always seen it as opportunity. When you have political and social upheaval like this and chaos, they want to take advantage of that because they want to have a seat at the table at the end of it. That is what we're facing. So it adds to the complications that we have in Syria. When I put my head on that and try to work out an answer to what needs to be done, I do believe we need to get a political solution in Syria. But how do you get it when Assad has the momentum? You're not going to get it. And the Iranians and the Russians are not going to permit it. The only thing you can do is change that momentum, and that begins with military, to change the momentum he has. Shut down his air power by the use of no-fly zones and buffer zones. Would he contest that? Unlikely, because we would then destroy his air power. That begins to change the political situation because now he's no longer dominating. And it puts pressure on people around him to look for a solution that's beyond Assad. That, I think, is the general thought process, that you have to get past Assad and you have to see a political solution there. Not necessarily the removal of this entire regime, but the removal of Assad and to some kind of accommodation with its own people, not the radicals, but with its own people that are fighting them. I don't think you can get there unless you took some kind of military action to balance the military situation. Then you can put together, then I think our friends in the region, I can't say and guarantee you this would happen, but they're all urging us to do what I just said. Then I think you get the makings of an Arab-Turkish coalition which the United States would participate in to drive and defeat ISIS in Syria. Those are kind of the steps I think that should be undertaken. But we have no plan to do any of that.
Thank you, General. My time has expired.
Thank you. Mr. Aguilar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Mr. Chesney and Mr. Wittis, I'm sorry. Can you say it one more time? Wittis. Okay, I was close. Mr. Chesney and Mr. Wittis, you mentioned during your opening comments the silence that the AUMF has on detention protocols. So, Mr. Wittis, if you could start, how would the alternative AUMF draft that you created treat detention protocols moving forward, in addition to the current detainees held under the 2001 AUMF?
Right, so this is an excellent question. So under the draft that we wrote, you also have a notional silence about detention operations, except that the language that we used to authorize force is the exact same language that the D.C. Circuit has used to describe under the current AUMF, the detention authority that it embeds. And so what we were trying to do there was not change the status quo as to detention, except to add ISIL to the list of groups that ISIL and its associated forces, that you could apply the AUMF's detention authority to. I suppose we can be criticized along the same lines that Professor Chesney criticized the administration for sort of doing it elliptically rather than directly. As I have, this committee knows I'm all for being explicit about detention authorities, which has been a big theme of a lot of my work. And so if there were any inclination in the broader political community to make detention authority under this AUMF explicit, I think that would be a wonderful, wonderful thing and a very appropriate thing for the committee to do. My concern about the way the administration has worded this draft is that because it's not piggybacking off of the existing AUMF, the moment you detain somebody under it, you would have a habeas litigation in which you would have to and I think the administration would win, by the way, but you'd have to litigate the question, does detention authority exist under this AUMF? I think under our draft, it's a lot clearer what the answer to that question would be.
Mr. Chesney?
I agree with everything Ben said.
Thank you, gentlemen, and that doesn't take away anything from the broader strategic discussions that my colleagues, some incredible questions that have been asked, but I did want to delve into that piece because it was common between your testimonies, the written and the public, and I appreciate it. Going back to Mr. Congressman O'Rourke's comments, you two gentlemen didn't get to answer that piece, and I know he mentioned possibly putting it in writing, but if you could discuss what you feel winning looks like and what the conditions for us to achieve success would look like.
I'll just offer a few preliminary thoughts, and these are similar to what General Keane said earlier. I think a big part of success involves ensuring that ISIL does not have a safe haven within which it can conduct, first of all, its own external operations, and that doesn't necessarily mean operations against the United States, though obviously that would be our first and foremost concern, but it could be operations in Europe, it could be operations against Jordan, it could be operations in Turkey, in any number of other places. Secondly, and slightly distinct from that, a safe territorial haven from within which they're able to attract and train foreign fighters who then go back and, even if not in any way subject to ISIL's direction and control, nonetheless going back and as local homegrown terrorists then carrying out attacks and destabilizing our allies in the area. These are things that we need to prevent ISIL from being able to do.
I don't really have much to add to that. I mean, I think the focus on safe havens and ungoverned territories is critical. These lead to very bad outcomes, and the last 20 years is just one example of that after another. And I think the instinct to create, to remove, to allow sovereign power from reasonable governments, non-exporting of violence governments over what are now ungoverned territories is a pivotal objective both in this area and in other parts of the world where we're dealing with similar problems.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your patience and yield back.
I appreciate your patience in waiting to get in very good questions. Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to thank our witnesses for your testimony today. Your insights have been invaluable, and I think this is a very important discussion. I think there's showing no greater responsibility that any of us have here on this committee or in government when the decisions come out as to when or whether or not to send our men and women in uniform into harm's way, and to get it right when we do. You all have made clear very important points about why an AUMF is important. Again, sending the signals to our allies and our enemies, as well as our troops, that the lawmaking branch of government were to stand behind their efforts to defeat ISIL. I want to give each of you an opportunity, and this has been a pretty thorough discussion already, but give you an additional opportunity to talk about and point out the important points that should be left in an AUMF, which in this as it's drafted, and which should be removed. And then within the time that we have, and if you can't get to everything, perhaps additional points in writing, if you would. Some of the first points that things that we need to see in the theater right now to signal that there has been a turn. Clearly, nature hates a vacuum, and there's a vacuum right now there that ISIL is filling. And there's also the saying that if they're strong, they have to be with you, and I think that's why you're seeing this growing support of ISIL, because they are strong and getting stronger right now. What would indicate an initial tactical success within the theater of conflict that would show that the tide has turning, that would hopefully lead and then indicate that we're on the road to achieving strategic success? And then finally, if you could, long-term, how do we defeat this radical, violent ideology? Because in many ways, this is an ideological war as well as a violent military one. So I understand I've asked a lot there, and if you can't get to everything, I understand, but perhaps some additional thoughts in writing would be helpful too. But General, should we start with you?
Okay, thank you. Well, certainly in terms of some near-term tactical success that would indicate that we're beginning to turn the tide against ISIS is to capitalize on what we have already achieved in Iraq. We have stalled their offensive in Iraq largely through the use of air power. We have retaken some territory, some modest territory back in Baji and also up in Sinjar in the north. But what is coming next, and I think you're very much aware of it, is largely a counteroffensive military campaign to retake the major environs of Mosul, Tikrit, Fallujah, and part of Anbar province, essentially fighting up the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys is what we're really talking about here. And And that counteroffensive will be a major campaign, and if successful, clearly that will demonstrate that the tide has truly turned against ISIS. They will have to flee into Syria, which is their de facto capital now. It's where they maintain many of their and much of their resources. It's where their recruiting and training is taking place, and it will continue to be something of a safe haven to them, because there's, at least in the near term, there's no ground force to act against them, although we'll try to continue to find targets against them. But that will send a huge message in terms of initial tactical success against ISIS. And I think it would have some impact, don't know for certain, but my judgment tells me it begin to have some impact on whether people want to join this organization or not, when they see it largely beginning to be destroyed right before their eyes. So I think that's very important to us. And as we have said many times here, and I think everybody sitting at the table here is in agreement, that's an immediate military strategy, but we need a longer-term strategy that deals with the ideology, or we will be dealing with ISIS-like enemies again. And that truly should be avoided. We have an incredible lexicon of learning experience here after, it'll be 14 years this September of dealing with this radical Islamic issue, and we still, as we sit here now, do not have a comprehensive strategy to deal with it. Undermining their ideology in a global alliance is what I suggested, and I think that's largely dealing with the people in the region who have to do this, because the ideology is tied to the Islamic religion. But it also, from a practical sense, an alliance like that would share intelligence, it would share training, it would share technology, so that people in it are all benefiting from it. And I don't think we would craft that strategy. I think we would bring that alliance together, and the alliance would craft it. And what the input we would get from the participating nations who are dealing with this would be very significant, in my judgment, in terms of how to approach it and what practical means are there to do it. And I'll stop right there so others have an opportunity to talk.
My time has expired, and I wish we had time. 5 minutes goes by too fast. I would appreciate the input from the other witnesses on the things that I raised, but I do thank you all for your input here today. I also want to make the point that I am encouraged that this needs to be a multinational coalition, and that we need to see the leaders and nations in the Arab world also step up, which I see that they are doing. We need to see more of that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Ashford?
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to be the last questioner. But thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to just make a few points. I also was in Afghanistan and Iraq with Congressman Moulton and Congressman Safranek and Congressman Wilson. It was an extremely important trip. Went everywhere, pretty much, and these answers have been right in line with the thinking, at least that I've come back with. And it was very important to have Congressman Moulton there because of his work with General Petraeus. He was able to really zero in and laser-like on the questions that many of which have been asked today. Let me just say I absolutely agree with the panel, General Keane for sure, and that is that the #1 goal here is to destroy ISIS, and that we need to refresh, rewrite, do again, whatever it is, the resolution that's there. We had several conversations, I did, I know Congressman Moulton did, and others, with members of the military and leaders, King Abdullah and the Prime Minister in Iraq and so forth. And everyone said the same thing. We need to have a clear resolve. I know I was on a C-130 and the navigator said, Congressman, do you think you can get a resolution? And I said, well, we'll see if we can. But I mean, it's clearly the case. I've been struggling with, and I also would just say this. I absolutely reject the idea that somehow these Muslim Arab countries cannot, with our help, be successful. I think that's just not correct. I know you're saying the opposite, but I hear that. and that we are an exceptional nation, and that we are going to have to maybe play a role that maybe somewhat outweigh those of others. And also that the ideological work, which clearly every leader we talked to, King Abdullah was emphatic about the need to address sectarian education to deal with economic development. And he did talk about a Syrian strategy, and it's a little more it's a little more long term. But let me just ask this. I know in Nebraska, what I get asked is, are we going to need boots on the ground? And I know you've answered this. My sense is that we haven't defined that yet. We don't know exactly what the assistance is going to be. We are an assist role at the brigade level now, and we have intelligence support as well as our Air Force and Navy pilots, whatever. So just define, I think you're right. I think we have to have a broader resolution. But boots on the ground does not necessarily mean a brigade. But if there is something going on in the field where Americans need to, I'm sorry for the long question, need to get involved, that's also boots on the ground, technically. They're on the ground. So, General, could you, if you would?
Well, let me just, first of all, I appreciate your comments, and you go into the region like that. It's insightful listening to you. We do create a false narrative here, and it's this, and rightfully so. We don't want to be involved in a protracted war like Iraq or Afghanistan. Certainly, we all understand that. But also, nobody is talking about that here either. So we get a choice between, we don't want to have boots on the ground that will lead us to a protracted war where hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops are involved. I don't know anybody that is making such a proposal or recommendation. There's certainly nobody in the Pentagon, to be sure, and I don't know anyone who is opposed to the President's strategy is suggesting such a thing either. But we are suggesting what's reasonable. And it is reasonable that the coalition lead and we help. So we do need some boots on the ground to make them more effective.
Right.
And I think that's reasonable. So what are we really arguing over here? We're arguing over scale.
Right.
The present policy is nothing below brigade level. I'm saying you got to get down to battalion level where the fighting's going on. And maybe we'll eventually get there because as we begin to do this, General Alston and his team will want the same thing. And then we need Apache helicopters, AC-130 gunships, and et cetera, et cetera. This is modest improvement, in my judgment, that gets you an exponential better result. Now, let me throw something out that maybe you would disagree with. If this offensive fails, we try it, and it fails, do we wring our hands and say, okay, we're going to come back next year with the same force, with more boots on the ground, better trained force, we'll give it a try in 2016? Or, if this is truly in our national interest, maybe a reasonable alternative is to have an Arab coalition force that the United States is part of, form in Kuwait, and we put that force on the ground, which would mean some brigade combat teams to do that. Is that something we should do now? Absolutely not. We want the burden to be borne by the Iraqis. But if it's failure and we can't seem to get there, should that be an alternative that we should at least consider? I think it is.
If I may, and I don't, my clock isn't working, so I may be over. I agree with you, and I think that is the kind of definition, because Mosul is tough, and it may be, or these other operations, and quite frankly, 2016, we were told that's in play. That it's going to take, it may take 2016 with other efforts, and it may take more American forces. So that's, as we draft this thing, I think that advice has to be taken into consideration. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Y'all have answered a wide range of questions, and I think you can tell members are very serious and very concerned about this. I don't want to try your patience too long. I've got one other thing I want to get comments from our legal experts, if I may, because it continues to bother me in some ways. And my question is, can the way an enemy define itself or affiliate itself matter when it comes to an AUMF? Because we have stretched the meaning of the 2001 AUMF so far that anyone who has a connection with the attacks of 9/11, it's just hard to even believe those words have much meaning. And we have this situation where there have been incidents where al-Nusra and ISIS have disassociated themselves from each other and actually fought with each other, and yet the claim is once you're under the affiliated with al-Qaeda, you're always affiliated with al-Qaeda, no matter what you do or say. So we don't want people to be able to change their name and thus not be subject to attack. On the other hand, is there nothing that you do or say that ever changes your affiliation? I mean, I don't know. Do y'all have legal opinions about the way that works or doesn't work?
So I think at the polar levels, the answer to your question is, I think, pretty clear, which is to say, let's say, you know, I'm a member of al-Qaeda and I openly and publicly renounce and break my affiliation with the group. I think there's a pretty good argument under those circumstances that to the extent that the AUMF once covered me, it may no longer cover me. And similarly, if you imagine a faction of al-Qaeda that breaks off and says, you know, we want to start a peace process, right? I think you could make an argument that you might think about that group very differently under the AUMF. Both of those are somewhat fantastical examples. But I think the other side of it is if al-Qaeda changes its name tomorrow to Greenpeace, no one would seriously argue that we then lack the authority to, you know, attack, you know, the Greenpeace front in Syria. Where the question gets very hard is where you have these ever-splintering groups that are historically affiliated but maybe no longer affiliate, or maybe offshoots of groups that are themselves offshoots. And here I think, you know, I go back to the point that, you know, we started with, which is that the underlying document is aged. It is very appropriate, given that, to write a document that describes the war that we are fighting rather than, in fact, rather than the war that we thought 13 years ago we would be fighting. By the way, that document will have a shelf life and a half-life too, and it will start degrading almost as soon as you pass it, which is another reason that the idea of whatever you call it, the renewal or the sunset or the re-engagement, no pun intended, is a good one. And it forces you to come back and say, does this document still describe what we want to be doing? The core of the problem you identify is unsolvable, because unlike, you know, the Third Reich, which doesn't morph, right? It asserts a sovereignty. It is what it is. You know, this is more fluid than that.
Okay, Professor Chesney.
So I think this underscores one reason why the oversight provision that our draft had emphasized, specifically including a requirement that when the administration or when the Pentagon or whoever identifies a group as an associated force or a successor force, that there be some, certainly at least to Congress and preferably to the American public, that decision's been made. In other words, Ben's right. There's a level at which this is unsolvable with crafting of language, so you shine a spotlight on it and make sure that people are aware of how it's being interpreted. So that's one thing I'd say. And then the second thing I'd say is this is both a problem for the removing itself from the scope of the AUMF, but also coming into it. And so to give a concrete example of this, in the Sinai, there's a group, ABM, I'm going to mispronounce this, but it's something along the lines of Ansar Bait Makdisi. It had been an al-Qaeda affiliated group, but the Egyptians have done a tremendous job of taking out their leadership, and one consequence of all that is that the people now in charge apparently were open to tying in with ISIL instead, and they've made formal claims to affiliation with ISIL. So now you have this ISIL franchise in the Sinai. Well, you know, would they count if they've not taken any action or shown any inclination to take action against the United States merely by virtue of that formality? These are the debates we've been having for 13 years under the 2001 AUMF. This is an occasion to think more systematically about how to define things, and if there's no better way to define it, then you shine a spotlight on it.
Okay, fair point. Thank you again, all. Y'all have really been helpful, I think, to the committee, and we appreciate your time and patience over these last 3 hours. With that, the hearing stands adjourned.